Can we have a show of hands for whomever wants to ask a question? Colin.
Thanks very much. Colin from Amnesty. One of the reasons why we were particularly interested in these presentations, and they really do link in together, is that question of social attitudes and then the degree to which attitudes are actually held in a collective way socially, and then indeed how a marginalised issue can become a mainstream issue. I mean, Mary, you said an awful lot about, and I thought it was powerful, about how very often now rights in an advocacy discourse are used in a very sectoral way, and I think that reflects something about Irish society which can be very sectoral anyway. You know, one of the things that we struggle with a little bit at the moment as Amnesty when we're talking about advancing economic and social cultural rights protection in Ireland is sometimes the need to actually name the fact that we don't have a great tradition in Ireland of really caring very much at all about marginalised people, and that actually poverty isn't an issue that people in Ireland have cared about particularly. And the disenfranchisement of significant elements of society hasn't been something we've cared about particularly. And yet at the same time, you know, LGBT rights issues, an issue like same-sex marriage or marriage equality is a good example of what might be seen as a niche issue, though it's not to some of us obviously, becoming a mainstream issue. So how has that happened? And Mary, I suppose the question is to you particularly, how come, and of course the answer may be again down to socioeconomic status and people's ability to participate, is there anything to be learnt about how we advanced issues of marginalised groups when it comes to poverty and social exclusion from campaigns or issues like marriage equality, for instance, do you think?
Are you asking everybody? Do you want to answer that? Sorry, I thought you were going to ask a few questions. Yes. Do you want to ask a few?
Yeah, if there's anyone else, just raise your hand. Here we go.
It's not really a question. My name is Rory Ryder, work in Rialto with Fatima Groups United, and it's more just to add really, I suppose, to that whole, Mary was talking about power and human rights and nearly, you know, was one versus the other to some extent, do you know what I mean? And I suppose I was thinking of in Dolphin House, which is a social housing complex, they have used a human rights approach to challenge power, and I think in a very effective way. I mean, I'm sure Mary knows about that, and I think that sometimes when, for example, the language of human rights was sort of not alien, but people hadn't really taken it on board, and the shift in perception that, for example, tenants being told by Dublin City Council that the fact that there was condensation in their houses or sewage was coming up their bathroom was their own individual problem, to where understanding that actually is it the duty bearer, it would be Dublin City Council, and that people had rights within that. And they held an open hearing, and Dublin City Council were shamed, where now the maintenance people never say to people in the flat complex, you know, oh, that's something because you've been drying your clothes on the radiators, or, you know, throwing back that stuff. And I think the power that's given Dolphin House in terms of even now fighting for regeneration at a time of recession, while it's been cut back, is something. And I suppose just I'm interested in maybe the speakers talking about trade unions, because I think the abject failure of trade unions in this country to take up our rights in the austerity, I think it's linked to the fact that many of the leading members are in the Labour Party and have been caught up in social partnership. But I do think it's such a shame, and they've been led kicking and screaming to the March Against Austerity this Saturday, you know, very reluctantly to take a lead. Now, they have taken a lead, it's great, but comparison, I think Ignacio was saying about Spain, where they've taken a lead against austerity, and I would be interested to hear what people say, or what the speakers are saying on that issue.
Just have another question, but it's just behind you there.
And this is a question for Mary. I found it really interesting, the discussion on power and looking at the distribution of people from their professional groupings within the political system. And I'm wondering whether there's cause for self-reflection within the room itself as to people that are working within groups that are also part of a political system, and the fact that we are all professionals working in this area, and that we have, for the most part, very good qualifications for getting into the jobs that we have got. And, you know, what experience do we have to represent people, and are we representing people, and are we conceptualizing need and defining the right need at the right time, and how are we in a process ourselves, how are we ensuring that we are actually be it whatever group that you are working for. I work for an older person's group. How do I know that I'm actually representing the issues of older people today in the way that they want? And yeah, if you could just reflect on that. I don't know if you've ever thought of it before.
We'll just take one more and then we'll get some answers, and we'll go back as well. So maybe just this gentleman here just had a question as well.
Thank you very much. Just two quick things. Number one, thanks for doing all the questions, or some of them first, because that kind of equalises the power between up and below. The second thing was, one of the things was, how do you, people think of human rights as being international and understand that, but don't really understand it locally. And I was thinking about verbal and physical violence as human rights, and how that translates to the language around bullying, which ultimately is about verbal and physical violence. And can we change that language around bullying so that people can enjoy the rights locally as well as internationally? And what would you think?
Okay. That was probably one of the main points in some of your first slides, Sarah, about people like human rights, but they apply to others, not applicable to me.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, perhaps I'll talk about that question first. I think one of the things that our research shows is that it's quite hard for people to make the leap of imagination from saying, here is a sort of conceptual problem, to here's how it plays out in everyday life. And because we have this incredibly strong and growing culture of kind of individual self-actualisation, certainly in Britain, probably here as well, there's this idea that you don't just, if you've got a problem like you're being bullied, it may be a systemic problem, but it's also probably something you can do something about. And people get very uncomfortable when asked to then say, well, this is about somebody's rights being infringed, because they see that as almost a huge kind of a sledgehammer to crack a nut in a way. And what we hear is people saying it should be about common sense, it should be about best practice. So when I worked with public service frontline workers, it was all about, is my boss doing his job properly or her job properly? Are they actually just doing what they ought to be doing anyway? Because if they are, that's just best professional practice to not let someone get bullied at work. That's not about anyone's human rights, that's just about being a nice person and being a professional. So I wonder whether the communication on that could kind of try to skirt round the whole rights issue. I don't know whether rights are, I mean, that might be a bit controversial, I don't know whether rights are necessarily helpful to try and get public support for something like that. Having said that, though, I think there are other areas where creating a concept and helping the public understand that they are part of something bigger than themselves can be very helpful. And I think your example of the housing estate place, once people realised that their problem was an example of a bigger shared social concept, i.e., you know, the council's rubbish at sorting out our houses, then it gives people almost like a language and a pathway to ask for things within that framework, within that sort of conceptual framework. And so I guess it's, I don't know, I almost feel it's a creative communications issue to kind of get the issues that are relevant and find the story, find the imaginative construct that helps people see that this is an issue for all of us. And perhaps I'm talking more about comms than about sort of the political and the power discourses there. I had one more thing to say about what can be learned from campaigns on marginal issues. I think one of the challenges for poverty, to the original question, is that certainly in the UK at the moment, poverty is seen as a very, it's seen as existing in a world of scarce resources. So if we help people who are poor, we have less ourselves. The economy has been the top issue that people in Britain are worried about for the last 46 months. And the unemployment concern has like doubled and tripled in terms of when we survey people every month. So things like marriage equality, I think, are perceived less as being problems that take away from other people. I think apart from some perhaps more religious or some particular arguments about whether it takes away from others who are heterosexual people who are married, I don't think people see it as a right which, you know, uses up the resources of, there aren't only a certain number of marriages to go round. Whereas poverty alleviate, you know, we've had our quota for the year. Well, you know, that may be debatable, but I think some of the harder kind of economic issues may be more difficult to kind of get over. So I tried to kind of cover lots of things in that, and I've gone on for a while, so I'll stop now.
Mary, I might ask you to pick up on just some of the questions from the floor.
Yeah, just pick up where Sarah left off, because I think that probably is true that some of the advancement in the marriage equality campaign was a happy coincidence of opportunity opening up, because it's very clear that campaigns that are going to progress economic and social rights that have a price tag on them, particularly a distributional price tag where it would be more tax particularly to pay to implement a right, they're not moving. So there's a space in which some of the ones that don't have such a heavy price tag and have more maybe a cultural or moral price tag are more likely to move. And that's one really clear reason. I think one of the other reasons, though, that differentiates some of those campaigns is just pure capacity. And I mean, I was struck by Grania stressing how important it was to have a strong board of experienced people and to be able to give to it. And I'm kind of sitting there thinking, I mean, Nolan Hartigan would know this, just the struggle that unemployed organisations have just to keep their act together, to keep experienced people with them, to keep a cross-class alliance, and to keep some solidarity from people who have capacity to help organise with groups that have lesser capacity to mobilise. So I think there's a bit of learning in there. But I think in terms of what works, and I think it's back to the Dolphin House example as well, it's humanising stories. I mean, I think when I worked in the Vincent de Paul, there was sort of a rule: you weren't allowed to use a statistic without a story. You know, that you had to colour it for people, for them to be able to really get a picture of what you were talking about, and that's a really important part of any strategy. So it's not human rights as an either or, just in answer to that one. Some of the other questions on the response of the trade union movement, and a few options. Labour Party being too close to that, or Social Partnership or Croke Park. I was in discussion last week for Claiming Our Future, where some of the SIP2 members who were organising the protest on Saturday were kind of talking about their struggle to engage the trade union movement in the protest and to get them to participate. And I think it was less around the connection with the Labour Party and more about being in a very defensive state, where they are clinging to the Croke Park Agreement and have just a very defensive head on them and are afraid to put their heads up. So it's about that very narrow sectoral organisation of functionally defending their members and nothing else, because that's all they feel they can do right now. It is an issue across Europe. I know some of the Spanish and the Italian and the Greek trade unions are much more likely to be engaged in mobilisation and that, but there's big debates in each of those countries, trade union sector generally, about those kind of strategies. And there's a lot of splits in trade union movements right across Europe, where some want to go into kind of agreements and social, like the Portuguese trade union movement is completely split down the middle. One half of it signed a social compact, like Croke Park, the other half didn't and is trying to mobilise. So I think ours are probably the least mobilising, but I think it is an issue everywhere. And I think that the need to be self-reflective, I think, is very clear. And I think if part of rights involves enabling voice, I think NGOs have to practice what they preach there, both in terms of making sure that what they're lobbying and campaigning for is reflecting who they say they're representing, but also enabling those people to use their own voice and to be the voice of the campaigns where they can. I think is very important.
Grania, could I ask you just on that third question as well, because you mentioned voices of children and you also mentioned not some activist from Dublin going into the constituency office, actually a local person. And did you, by you, I mean marriage equality, change direction based on reflecting inwards at any point over the whole campaign?
Yeah, I mean, I think the, reflexivity on all of these things is really important, and some of our inviting international people over to pick their brains and see what has worked for them is part of a commitment to do that. I think that that's important to do. One of the points I just want to pick up that I obviously didn't in my speech, but Roisin making the point about like power and human rights. One of the things that I'm very clear about from my own work within marriage equality is that the issue of power, the invisibility as a result of the heterosexist society that we live in, is our issue is so invisible. The normative value of being heterosexual in this society is so normative that it is unseen. I mean, I heard somebody on Pat Kenny yesterday asking a guy who was talking about being gay in Ireland 40 years ago, why does he have to keep talking about this? Why can't he just get on with his life? And why do they have to shout it from the rooftops? And, the fact is that the odd time that gay people do speak out, or LGBT people do speak out, it is a tiny drop to combat the eternal pervasive chorus in public and political life of heterosexism. Now, obviously, as part of a marriage equality campaign, I am not going to say that to a TD that I'm trying to get to change his mind. But in this context, the whole issue of power and who has the power and who are the dominant group in society is fundamental to an analysis of why this is such an important issue. And it's fundamental to the idea of how a marginalised group can take an issue as a campaign and bring it to the central. So the strategy of when we have that conversation about normative values and what's the dominant one is another strategic decision that you take and you have.
Okay, on that note, I'm going to just unfortunately have to thank our three speakers, Sarah Castell, Mary Murphy and Grania Healy. We're going to have the closing remarks of the conference today, but fascinating stuff. I've learned a lot from it, so thank you all three.